Welcome back to History San Diego. I'm George Farrar. As we do from time to time in our series, I'd now like to broaden our perspective and take a look at a decade in history. It's time to take a look at what was going on in North America in the 1840s, specifically looking at Mexico and the United States. There's so much that happened in the 1840s. And meanwhile, as all this is going on, San Diego is struggling, having lost its status as a Mexican pueblo. It continues to struggle and face challenges in what we know now today as Old Town. And so, as part of Mexico in the last years that San Diego is part of Mexico, San Diego will have to deal with the Native American population that's making their last attempts to take back their homeland. Of course, they will not. And we will see that quite clearly ahead in our series. And also around this time, Robert Fitch is going around and mapping the area. So a lot is happening around San Diego, but not as much. The numbers have dropped in the population. And meanwhile, though, San Diego is part of a nation that's about to go to war with the United States of America over Texas. The Republic of Texas. We talked about that in our look at the 1830s, about how the Texans broke off from Mexico and how they formed up their own nation, the Republic of Texas. To broaden our perspective, we are actually going to now look at a map of North America, and we're going to see how large Mexico was at that time. We see the Republic of Texas, we see the United States, including the claims above the parallel going into what we know of today as Canada, okay, known as then as British America, and how the United States at one point was claiming more land than ultimately it would have in the northwestern corner. That's rather intriguing. We have to remember also that Canada was a possession of the British Empire, and so negotiations were going to have to be completed with Her Majesty Queen Victoria's government. So we see already that the United States has a lot of land, and it's going to be incredible to see what's going to happen in the 1840s as the United States and Mexico go to war. There was always a talk at that time then of manifest destiny, that it was the destiny of Americans, the United States, the citizens of the United States, to have a land from sea to shining sea. And so as the 1840s rolled on, that vision became brighter and brighter. And various territories were going to become states. And also there was going to be a number of presidents. And we'll talk about those presidents. So a lot is happening at this time in history. And so the United States begins the decade with 26 states. So by the end of the decade, though, it's going to have 30 states. So that's something that's remarkable. Now, what I'd like to do as we begin is talk about what some people in history have called the peculiar institution, because this peculiar institution, otherwise known as slavery, is going to be a huge force in the development of the United States of America, and is going to impact it because in 1840, we're around 20 years out from the American Civil War. And in the South, they kept the notion of slavery, where African Americans were subjected under the rule of a master. And though they were housed and clothed by their master, their labor was not compensated. They were not paid, and they were prisoners on the plantation. And all they could do if they wanted out was to find a way to either buy their slavery out, if the master would allow it, or to flee. Now, this became more and more of an issue as the years rolled on. In the 1840s, a lot more media began circulating about the struggle of the slaves, the abolitionists. You would start to see in these almanacs and these newspapers, these periodicals, these magazines, everything back then, of course, on paper and inscribed and engraved and drawn and illustrated. You would see these arguments that people were making, that slavery was immoral, was wrong, so we had the abolitionists. Look at the slave auction. These people would be split. Their families would be split. A child would be born. There was no guarantee that the mother and father would hold the child. Okay? Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to read to you something in black and white that will demonstrate to you what I'm talking about. And the idea that this was a commercial labor situation, and one of the things that's going to split the nation apart, because there was a view in the South that this was a normal course of business. So I'm going to read to you from a sheriff's sale, a announcement in apparently a newspaper. And the idea being that whenever anyone had property and owed debts that they couldn't pay, that property would be liquidated, much as we would have today. If you can't pay for your house or your car, they're going to go ahead and you may be put in a situation where you have to liquidate. And they'll come through and they'll take and they'll sell, and they'll do it through the government. In this case, you see the announcement of a court case. This was in Adams County in the state of Mississippi, apparently in Adams Circuit Court. And it says, by virtue of the above writ of fieri Bassi, to me directed, I shall expose at public sale to the highest bidder for ready money at the door of the courthouse in the city of Natchez within the hours prescribed by law on the 6th day of June next, all the right, title, and interest of the defendants in and to the following property, to wit, 6 Negro slaves named Becky, Israel, Mary, and 2 children, and Harriet. The same having been levied on as the property of the defendants to satisfy the above named plaintiff's claim and all costs. So the idea being that these 6 Negro slaves were property to be sold off to pay a debt, signed by Mark Izod, sheriff. So you see, if you can at this point see in black and white in print the fact that these are commercial transactions. Okay, so these people are used for their labor on plantations, picking cotton, taking care of the house. Some people had better lots in life than others. There was a plantation in North Florida called Kingsley Plantation. So, and I visited there. We know that various presidents of the United States owned slaves. Okay, but this was an institution, this peculiar institution was beginning to face question. And people are saying, this is wrong. And there were a number of states that didn't believe in this and outlawed it. The slaves would flee to the north, or they would flee up to British North America, up to British America, what we know of today as Canada. And again, a lot of injustice. There was some sensationalism that would happen in the media, but at a certain point, though, you had the basic facts, the simple facts. And at a certain point, too, also, you had a class of people, multiple classes of people. And some would argue, even in the North, that this, because it was mentioned in the Bible, that it was perfectly fine. But country after country, year after year, this institution was ending. But it persisted. It persisted in the South, and it persisted amidst a time of a lot of technological change that was coming along, the telegraph, the railroad. Now, we had, at that time in the United States, had a president, Martin Van Buren. He would run for re-election. His opponents called him Martin Van Ruin because the economy was not doing that well. It was not doing well at all. And we talked about that in our 1830s show. And so William Henry Harrison had run against him and lost in 1836, and he runs again in 1840. And people are saying, you know, we're going to have prosperity with Harrison. So you have essentially a political ad. This is one of our first, what you might say, of populist mass political campaigns that had a slogan. Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. You had William Henry Harrison, a somewhat elderly man, okay, 67 years old in 1841. Okay, so around that time. So, and at that time, that was somewhat old. Okay, but he had a distinguished political career, military career. He was a hero of Tippecanoe because he fought Native Americans. Okay, and he was the first governor of the Indiana Territory. And his opponents would say, you know, he's just an old man in a log cabin drinking hard cider. And he was able, through his campaign, to flip it around. And they would run around with these log cabins on wheels. And they would, you know, talk about drinking hard cider. And it was a populist, essentially a populist campaign, kind of a take on kind of what Andrew Jackson was trying to build. And so it was ideally, people were thinking, okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to get this man that's going to come in, and he's going to lead the country. So on March 4th, 1841, it's cold and it's somewhat rainy, and he's inaugurated President of the United States on the steps of the Capitol, and he gives a 2-hour talk. He's wanting to show his endurance, and so he has this really long speech, and he vows that he's only going to serve one term of office. And on that commitment he makes on that day, he is 100% right. Because, unfortunately, a month later, he will die in office. He will be the first president of the United States to die in office. Now, people speculate a lot about how the early presidents died. In this situation, people will say, well, he didn't wear a heavy coat at the inauguration. He walked around when it was in a wet suit, and he stood out there and talked and talked and talked and wore himself down. It was more likely than not that what happened was later on in the month of March, he caught pneumonia, and so he died in the White House. And the White House was very drafty, and it was just, there's a lot of things that were going on because these were the early years of the United States. So not as much technology, no central heat or things like that. So along comes the Vice President, John Tyler, and an interesting man. People didn't know what to do when William Henry Harrison passed away. The idea was that the Vice President would assume the duties and responsibilities of the President per what it said in the Constitution, but people didn't know exactly what that meant. That hadn't been completely worked out. Does that mean he finishes his term? Does it mean there's going to be a special election? Those kinds of things hadn't been worked out. And Tyler's opponents uh, nicknamed him his Excellency. Okay, people didn't have a lot of respect for the uh, the new president, and you can only imagine the bitterness a lot of people felt just a month after the inauguration to find that the hero of Tippecanoe, General William Henry Harrison, passes away, and now you have the vice president becoming president. But John Tyler, he assumed the presidency, and the unique thing about Tyler is more after his presidency, the fact that in 1860 he actually presides over the Virginia Secession Convention. As the states start to secede, they form up these assemblages of people, and they gather in the states. And he led the secession of the state of Virginia from the Union. But not only that, this former president of the United States actually runs for and wins a seat in the Confederate House of Representatives, but he dies before the before he can take office. And he has a unique distinction of being the only president to be buried under a flag not of the United States of America. In this case, for him, he was buried under the flag of the Confederacy. But his presidency is unique in one way. He takes office, which sets a precedent. He's not going to be the only vice president to become president. So it's something to keep in mind. It was an odd time in some ways. You had slavery, but you also had a religious fervor, and you also had people concerned about the future. There are these people called the Millwrights, and they believed that the end of the world was going to come about in the year 1843. So there were these people, and this idea got into the American population, okay, a segment of the American population, the world was going to end. So people would sell their horses, they would sell their farms, their houses, and they would gather together these I guess you could say these days a cult essentially, and they were going to get ready for the end of the world because the idea being of the second coming, that Jesus was coming back. And this won't be, of course, then the first time that a segment of the population gets riled up about things. And in this situation, you can only imagine what their lives were like when they realized when 1844 rolled around and they realized they were going to have to carry on. Now, just as John Tyler is leaving the presidency on March 3rd, 1845, Florida is admitted as a state into the Union. Now, Florida will be admitted as a slave state, and at that point, still incredibly somewhat rural. Now, on March 4th, 1845, James Knox Polk takes office as President of the United States. He will also serve one term, and he will have the distinction of leading the nation during the Mexican-American War. He will vow to get statehood for Texas, which was the Republic of Texas at that time, but was quickly moving towards statehood. So Texas is going to be a primary focus of his presidency. And so what will happen ultimately, if you recall, Texas was a province then that rebelled, and they ran the Mexicans out. But again, though, all of this was still disputed. Okay, Mexico did not recognize the Republic of Texas, so things were on very shaky ground. But no matter what, on December 29th, 1845, Texas became the 28th state in the Union. And so this was going to precipitate a reaction from Mexico, because what was going to happen was that President Polk was going to dispatch troops led by a general named Zachary Taylor down into the disputed area. And so one thing we can also recognize President Polk for was his working out of the Oregon country, where he was able to resolve through agreement with Great Britain the creation of the boundary line that we roughly know of today. And so that resolved the claims, sorted everything out in the Northwest. So the focus of the United States no longer had to be to the Northwest, it could be to the Southwest. The Mexicans made the first move, supposedly, and the argument was that the troops were on land of the United States, officially the state of Texas's land. So Congress decided, because of those attacks, to declare war on Mexico. And Mexico had declared war on the United States. So they were going to go ahead then and raise volunteers. And the idea was going to be people were going to go ahead and fight Mexico to secure the sovereignty of the United States' newest state, Texas. And you have this call to arms, volunteers for the Mexican War, recruiters, and people everywhere in the Union saying, let's go ahead as a nation, gather together, and fight the Mexicans. And one can only imagine what people were thinking in Old Town San Diego in those years. Because at some point word would get back to San Diego, and things were going to, in the coming years, were going to get incredibly dicey and very turbulent, and it's going to happen very quickly. And guess who's coming back to Mexico? You guessed it, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And so he's come back to Mexico. He was admitted back into Mexico from exile. And of course, he broke his promises that he had made, and he took over Mexico, and there was going to be a lot of fighting between the United States and Mexico, and this is going to, of course, then directly impact Alta California and what ultimately will happen with San Diego. And so we have John Fremont, we have Stephen Kearny, and these are military officers, and they are moving at a rapid pace in the early years of this war. And you can see the map here, and what an amazing time, a turbulent time this must have been. And it's there's so much that happens that what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you later in our series a specific show about the Mexican-American War, a specific show about how it impacts San Diego as these troops come into San Diego. We'll talk about the Mormon Battalion. We'll talk about Stephen Kearny. We'll talk about Robert Stockton, Commodore Robert Stockton. And we'll talk about the Battle of San Pascual, December 1846. And there's just so much that's going to happen. And I've spoken with a lot of affection in a way about Pio Pico. And he was the last Mexican governor of Alta California, and he's going to flee. So we'll talk more about him in that show as well. He's going to flee out of Alta California. And so there's going to be this power vacuum, and the times, they are going to change, and they are going to change incredibly quickly, because what's going to happen is the Navy is going to show up. The United States Navy is going to show up on the Pacific Ocean. And there we have Commodore John Sloat raising the American flag. with a view there. It was an illustration of Monterey Bay in Alta California. So this is going to be something that's going to be amazing because it's going to be the United States is going to take possession of California. Statehood will not come till 1850, but they'll seat a legislature by December of 1849. And we're going to talk about why things are going to happen even quicker, not just because of the military action, but first, we're going to have to get back to the Mexican-American War that is going to drag on a bit more. Now, it's going to happen to where Americans are going to fight their way into Mexico City. And there's even talk, what will happen after the war? Will the United States just take complete possession of Mexico? And can you imagine what a future that might have been? Can you imagine a dimension where we hold Mexico City and we just divide Mexico into different states? But there were different things about politics relating, I would think sometimes, to the balance of free and slave states and also various other cultural things. So that ultimately, of course, did not happen. But boy, you're going to see later on this big, huge chunk of land. It's amazing. But there are some dissenters. There was a congressman out of Illinois, only served one term. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and he had the audacity to challenge the presumption that the war was started because it was on that the troops were on officially land of the United States. Congressman Lincoln asks for the president to furnish evidence and facts that ultimately that the troops were officially on Texas land and not Mexican land when the battle occurred. And that was something that was truly remarkable, especially for a man who had practically no political capital. I mean, this was in 1847. And it's interesting how, though it would not accomplish what he set out to do, these proposed spot resolutions, the House of Representatives wasn't going to act on it. It took a lot of political courage to do that. And he ultimately, of course, we know, he'll have a lot of courage when it comes in 1861 when he becomes 16th President of the United States and leads the United States during the Civil War. In California, in this essentially an unorganized territory, gold is discovered, and it's going to incentivize a huge mass of people to start flooding into California. And this, of course, then will dramatically impact San Diego over a period of years, especially as eventually in time people move closer and closer to the bay and port activity increases, because all these people that are going to flock to make their fortune, to get their riches, they're going to need provisions, they're going to need supplies, and they're going to have cash to do it, because before you can get all that gold, you're going to have to outfit yourself. And so trade routes are going to develop, and there's going to be such an influx of settlers. So this is going to be something that's going to be really incredible. And these people are they're going to hear about this. It's going to take a while for the news to get back east. And it'll be understood by the end of 1848, going into 1849, that there's this big thing happening out here. And if you want to make a lot of money, you got to go mine some gold. and there are these maps, and the idea was people were literally just dropping what they were doing. Okay, these were people that you know they were farmers, or they were tool people, or they were shopkeepers, or again, these people were hopping aboard steamships. Okay, remember, land was somewhat treacherous still to get across the country. The railroads hadn't completely developed. We'll talk about that shortly. They hadn't completely developed, of course, then, obviously, out west. The Mexican American War had just wrapped up. And so you can see here, uh, price of passage through $90. Quickest, safest, and cheapest. You could take the steamship Nicaragua. They would land in San Francisco, and they would get outfitted. These people would generally be called the 49ers, okay? And these people would be sold all these supplies, and they would have to go, if they wanted to mine this gold, they would have to trudge through and then stake claims, okay? And the whole thing was, it's amazing. It boggles the mind at how the American people were able to be whipped up into such a frenzy. Okay, there are people that wanted greater opportunities than what they had back east. And here you have, it says, the Emigrant's Guide to the Gold Mines. 3 weeks in the gold mines, or adventures with the gold diggers of California in August 1849, together with advice to immigrants, with full instructions upon the best method of getting there, living, expenses, etc., etc., and a complete description of the country. Now, you know, there were people, not as many people, that had settled there or had gotten that early stake, that early claim. And boy, they just really you can only imagine these people that suddenly showed up and wanted their piece of whatever the American dream would have been in the 1840s. This idea of getting rich quick, quick, get on out there and get your gold. Gold fever, it's noted here in the Hartford Daily Current. California gold fever is approaching its crisis. We're told the new region that's just become a part of our possessions is El Dorado after all. And so, even before the birth of the state, when it's an unorganized, not even a designated territory, just simply an acquired possession, you can see the history of California being born in the idea of the United States and the impact of the people of the United States on this incredibly rural land. Because what people want riches. Now, meantime, American forces have gone into Mexico. It'll all be resolved by 1848. There's an almanac from 1849 depicting what happened last year. Remember, news travels incredibly slowly. Okay, here we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, written in Spanish and English, including articles that the Senate later reduced or removed. And there's an official exchange copy of the treaty, providing proof that the treaty was ratified by the Mexican government. All right. So now, after all this has happened, and people died in this war, right? And a lot of things happened. A lot of people's lives got really ripped up. But there was a man who rose above it all, and that was General Zachary Taylor, the man who was there from the beginning. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready. And he'll have a lot of legend. And again, here's where the illustrative media starts to tell the story. And so there's Old Rough and Ready on his horse. He's giving orders. We have this hero, this prepackaged hero. Some of these people are reluctant, I think. I think he, more than anyone, was one of the more reluctant ones. But someone who's in the military would look to duty for their country. And when a lot of people will gather and say, "We want you," I think he wasn't going to say no. But he had a plantation. And it's interesting. Again, another elderly person here, and so he's going to go ahead then and accept the call for candidacy, and so you have him. You have all this art promotion of the idea. You see the Battle of Palo Alto, of Buena Vista, and some of these accomplishments aligned along this thing here. A beautiful, beautiful illustration. And again, the idea of the man on the horse, the man who came through and he led the fight. And America, the United States, was victorious over Mexico. But you know what? Again, it's United States, and guess what? There's dissent. And in this case, we had a little campaign of General Zachary Taylor sitting atop a pile of skulls, and it says, "An available candidate, the one qualification for a Whig president." The Whigs were a political party that died off. Okay, they ultimately transitioned over time to eventually becoming Republicans. One qualification for a Whig president. So not everybody thought the war was a great thing, and so ultimately they put up Zachary Taylor for president and Millard Fillmore as vice president. Yes, we're going to have another vice president ascend the presidency, but that's going to happen in 1850. We'll have a lot to bring you, and I'll talk with you a little bit about Zachary Taylor's passing, because there's a unique note about that, and we will resume our history when we go back later on in our series and look at 1850. I'm going to have a lot to tell you about Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore, because it's all going to relate to statehood being granted to California. And so there's another campaign, and ultimately General Zachary Taylor gets elected president. Millard Fillmore gets elected vice president. And so here we see that he was our 12th president, and he's only going to serve for barely, not even a year and a half. That's in Scripture, his inauguration. And by this point, the United States has 30 states. And you can see now, looking at this map, that the United States extends all the way across to the Pacific. And it almost resembles the mainland boundaries that we have. Now, of course, we see Russia still owns Alaska, and Hawaii is a kingdom. And the gas and purchasing gray on that southwestern corner won't be purchased until 1853. Okay, so things are going to get sorted out. But this, again, and it boggles the mind every time I do one of these shows, is the vast amount of land. Let's think about something. You have a problem with slavery, and the idea, I think, with a lot of this grab for land was maybe the problem can be solved through land. Okay, there are going to be people that are going to have free states, and there are people that are going to have slave states, right? And there was a hope that there would be a compromise, and ultimately a compromise was worked out after President Taylor died. Now, here's the thing: when you look at the beginning of the decade, you see the railroads. The railroads, the most fascinating thing. I really want to talk more with you about the railroads, and we'll do that in the 1850 show and in each of our decade shows, because the Transcontinental Railroad will eventually come along, late 1869, and all this is going to start to impact San Diego massively. But right now we see it's mostly a phenomenon of the Northeast. But as we see going further along, we see more of a sophistication. With the railroad comes communication between towns and cities, and news travels faster. And let me repeat that one more time. News travels faster. If you can get someone aboard a train, and it can move way faster than someone on horseback, and they can start moving materials, start moving newspapers. Okay, news is on paper, right? Pictures, ideas, thoughts, books. The railroad is going to do a lot for the United States, a vast land. And so, though there are going to be some hindrances and some obstructions that are going to get in the way, but it's amazing to talk about American history with you today here on here on our show. And it's just it's intriguing how much this is going to do for the city of San Diego and ultimately what will become the state of California, 31st state of the United States. But that will come to 1850. And that will come after General Zachary Taylor, President of the United States, dies. He went out to the Washington Monument. Okay, so they were just starting the Washington Monument. That tells you how long ago this was. He had some milk, cold milk, and he had some cherries. He got back to the White House and he was feeling horrible. I suspect cholera, but there were people that tried to say that he was poisoned. Big conspiracy theory. And I can remember in the early 1990s watching on television as they exhumed the poor man's body out, pulled the coffin up out of the crypt, or out of the where it was buried, or however, and they just lifted him up and they took him into a facility, and they determined there wasn't poisoning. I think that was, I don't know where to go with that one. People don't understand that the times back then were incredibly tough. They were rough. Okay, clean water was not a big thing, and probably one of the more obscure facts I'll throw at you. If someone was in around 1860, 1861, when Buchanan and Lincoln met, President Buchanan was about to leave office, and the new incoming President Abraham Lincoln came in. One of the big things they talked about at the White House was the water facilities. Um, you know, at this time, it wasn't, you had to kind of keep your presidents alive, right? And you had to have safe water, and you had to have a decent home. And a lot of that stuff, the country itself was going to advance with true plumbing and with railroads, and eventually, much later on, fans and air conditioning and central heat. And the world for U.S. citizens and the world at large was going to get better. But these were very tenuous times. And so we're going to fold right on back into San Diego, and we're going to go back into looking specifically at what will happen in San Diego in the last half of the 1840s. So my focus is going to be intensely on the Mexican-American War as it impacts California, the development of California into statehood, and then ultimately the incorporation of the city of San Diego. So the next year or so on this series is going to be quite amazing. I've had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you've had fun watching it. These are some amazing shows. Every time I do these shows, I have so much fun doing it. We're going to go on location eventually once the weather gets better and once it warms up. But for now, I want to invite you to check out History San Diego on Facebook, and to check out History California on Facebook, and to go to the leftturnetwork.com. If you like a lot of these photos and maps and things, they are on Facebook, specifically at History San Diego, and some of the more broader California photos are over at, illustrations, basically. Illustrations, maps, everything. It's all there. I'm very proud of what I've accomplished on this series, and just as I mentioned on my prior show about development of the pueblo de San Diego, American history is amazing, and you look at how far Americans have come, and that was just 1840s. Okay, we're going to be doing these decade by decade shows throughout the series, so it's going to be really interesting. But it's phenomenal, the grit and determination and the persistence and survivability of the United States of America. Incredible. All right, so I want to thank you for watching. Take it easy. See you later.